Hello and welcome to the Sandusky Library Underground Railroad Cemetery Walk. My name is Jeremy Angstadt. I am the Museum Services Manager for the Sandusky Library and Holland House Museum. I want to introduce a couple things to you before we actually start the cemetery walk. The first is a term you might not be familiar with, which is freedom seeker. A freedom seeker is a person who is escaping slavery to get freedom. That's the term that historians have been using more recently to describe people who are escaping to freedom. The other thing I want to talk about are the Siebert Papers. The Siebert Papers are a collection of documents documenting the Underground Railroad in Ohio. They were put together by an Ohio State professor named Wilbur Siebert, who lived in the late 1800s. He did a lot of research trying to document the Underground Railroad. As you know, the Underground Railroad was technically illegal because of the Fugitive Slave Act. So because of that, it was very hard to document all the people who were involved with it. So he is probably the best source for information on the Underground Railroad for people in Ohio. So we'll be referencing him a lot in his papers. So without any further ado, we'll head on over to the first tombstone. This is the grave of George T. Barney. Barney was born in Sand Hill, New York on May 2nd, 1814. Sometime he moved to Michigan. We're not sure when, sometime when he was a young man, because his whole family didn't move there. While he was in Michigan, he met his wife, Caroline S. Lawrence. They were married on December 19th, 1842. Sometime in late 1842, after they were married, or early 1843, the couple moved down to Milan. They lived there for a few years, and somewhere in the 1850s, they moved here to Sandusky. They eventually had two children together, George and Cora. Unfortunately, their son George died in 1873 from typhoid, and their daughter Cora died in 1875 from some sort of unknown disease. George T. Barney spent his entire working life working at Horning, Pringle and Company hardware store here in Sandusky. He retired in 1891, the same year as his wife unfortunately died. Once he retired, he really didn't do much outside of his working life. He wasn't really active in politics, wasn't really active in any of the social clubs here in town. He died on November 18th, 1898, and they had a very simple funeral for him at his home, which was located out on 422 East Washington Street. As for his involvement in the Underground Railroad, George and his wife, helped freedom seekers get to freedom. They gave them shelter, they gave them money, they gave them food. The oral history has it that they actually hid the people in the basement of their house, so we do know that they were really involved. So with that being said, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Joseph Root. Joseph Root was born in Brutus, New York in 1807. He studied law in Auburn, New York, eventually moved to Ohio in 1829 and was admitted to the Ohio Bar Association the next year in 1830. He practiced law down in Norwalk for a while. While in Norwalk, he married his wife, Mary Buckingham, on June 22nd, 1835. They ended up having 5 daughters together: Sarah, Martha, Amelia, Lizzie, and Mary. Joseph Root was elected the prosecuting attorney for Huron County in 1837, and he was elected to the state senate in 1840 and served until 1841. He was elected twice to Congress as a Whig, the 29th and 30th Congress. While there, he was part of the Immortal 14. The Immortal 14 were 14 members of Congress who voted against the Mexican-American War, something that the move of them voting against it was very unpopular because the war was actually very popular in a large part of the country. He was re-elected to the 31st Congress as part of this Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party were people who, the idea was if a freedom seeker who made it to a state where there was free soil, where there was no slavery, they were free from slavery. Kind of a precursor to the Republican Party. In 1848, he introduced a motion to admit both New Mexico and California as territories, and both to have no slavery in them, to be free states eventually. He served as a presidential elector in 1860 for Lincoln. He was appointed the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio in 1861, and we know he served in the Ohio State Legislature in 1869. Sometime between 1869 and 1873, Root switched parties. He was a Republican, a very stout Republican, and he switched to the Democratic Party somewhere in there. This happened with several local politicians. We're not exactly sure why. There must have been some sort of breach in the local Republican Party that caused people to switch to the Democratic Party, but there's several other people we'll talk about that this happened with. In 1873, he was a Democratic delegate for the Ohio Constitutional Convention. In 1875, he ran for the Erie County judge and unfortunately lost. His wife died the next year on October 6, 1876, and he died 3 years later, April 7, 1879, in his house. Wilbur Siebert lists Root as an operator on the Underground Railroad, and he probably hid freedom seekers in his house on their way to freedom. So with that said, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of John McElveen. John McElveen was born in Plymouth, Ohio in 1835 to parents Matthew and Nancy. He came to Sandusky in 1853. When he first got here, he was working at the general store of W.T. and A.K. West as a clerk. Then he became a teacher for a short period of time. After that, he went over to the Oberlin Academy to study, but unfortunately, he was only there for a short period of time before he had to leave again due to illness. In 1861, he planted a vineyard here in Sandusky. That same year, he also married his wife Jane Huntington on June 26, 1861. They ended up having 4 children together: John, Ralph, Janet, and Nettie. After his vineyard, he did a lot of different businesses. He was in the real estate business, he was in the insurance business for a while. Later, he helped organize the Sandusky Tool Company. Some of you may have heard of it before. It was a very big tool company here in Sandusky, located not too far from where the Maritime Museum is today. And he was a big part of helping to get that up and going. After that, he also went into the ice business. As some of you know, Sandusky had a fairly large ice business at the time. The bay is relatively shallow, and when it gets cold enough, it'll actually freeze pretty quickly and deep. So we had a very large ice business, and he went into that. He actually had one of the largest ice houses on all of Lake Erie. He also helped create the Columbus and Sandusky Shortline Railroad Company. He was the president of that until 1893 when he retired. He was also the vice president of the Toledo Fire and Marine Insurance here in Sandusky until his death. Unfortunately, his wife died on September 23rd, 1911, and he died on August 12th, 1915 in Massachusetts. He was out visiting his daughter, Janet, recovering from an illness, and his death was actually quite unexpected. He was on the road to recovery and unfortunately took a turn for worse. They brought his body back here to Sandusky to have the funeral. His home was located over on Huron Avenue. For the Underground Railroad, John and his brother Matthew helped freedom seekers get to Canada. They gave money to forwarding agents to help get them into Canada and get them safely across into freedom. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of Francis Drake Pearce. He was born in Ontario County, New York in 1796. From New York, he moved to Columbus to study law, and after graduating from there, he moved up here to Sandusky to practice law. He worked as a lawyer here for his entire adult life. He married his wife Sarah Strong on January 18th, 1829, and they eventually had 3 children together: Francis, Sarah, and Mary. He died on March 22nd, 1886, and they held his funeral at the Congregational Church here on town in March 24th, 1886. His role in the Underground Railroad is really interesting because when he first started, he was actually opposed to helping freedom seekers. He was not an abolitionist. He believed in the rule of law and the idea of the Fugitive Slave Act. He was a lawyer for a slave owner against a fugitive slave named Benjamin Johnson, which we'll talk about in the next person. He was also a member of the Colonization Society. That was a society that advocated for free African Americans moving back to Africa. Sometime in the late 1830s, he did have a change of heart, and he actually became very fierce abolitionist. By his own account, he was threatened both physically and with the destruction of his property because he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. In 1845, he actually saved 2 freedom seekers, freed them from custody, and they got to safety. Because of this, he was arrested and was taken to trial. Took him 3 times, but eventually he was given a $500 fine, but this was paid by his friends. By his own count, he helped hundreds, if not thousands, of people to safety. Like I said, it would seem to be general knowledge he was threatened a lot, but he never was attacked. His house was never attacked, and he only was arrested that once. So he was actually a very successful part of the Underground Railroad. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of Lucas Beecher. Beecher was born in New Haven County, Connecticut on March 31st, 1798. When he was 13, a tree actually fell on his leg and they ended up having to amputate it. When he was 18, he moved to Westburg, New York. After that, he worked as a teacher once he was there to raise money to go to law school. He was never able to go to law school, but he became an apprentice lawyer at the office of Hopkins and Beecher. In 1824, he moved to Pennsylvania and was admitted to the Pennsylvania bar there in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. While he was there, he married his wife, Jane Turk. In 1828, he moved to Sandusky to enter into practice with Eleutherius Cook of the Cook-Doran House. Some of you are probably very familiar with that name. They were some of the first members of the Erie County Bar Association. In 1830, he actually went blind, and he went to New York City for an experimental treatment. It took a little bit of time, but it actually worked, and he was able to overcome his illness and come back and work as a lawyer. Even while he was blind, he did continue working. He would have people read documents to him, and he would be able to keep working. Over his years here in Sandusky, he paired with different people to form different legal firms. He formed with John Campbell, then Pitt Cook, then with Cloyer Leonard, and then eventually with his son. Beecher died on October 18th, 1882. As the Underground Railroad, he was actually really interesting. He placed his idea or his thought was that he placed God's law over man's law, and that was his justification for being a part of the Underground Railroad. He did hide freedom seekers in his house, we know. I mentioned the Benjamin Johnson case. So in the 1830s, there was a freedom seeker named Benjamin Johnson who came to Sandusky and actually stayed for a while to try and help other people get to freedom. Eventually, Benjamin Johnson was arrested to be sent back to the person who said he was his master. Beecher defended him. He said that even though Benjamin Johnson was a freedom seeker, because he was sold to his new master in Ohio, which was a free state, it meant that Benjamin Johnson didn't actually belong to anyone and he had won his freedom. And the judge ruled in favor of Benjamin Johnson and Beecher, which is great that he got his freedom. The other case that he was probably most active in was with a man named Grant Ritchie. Now, Grant Ritchie was an African American here in Sandusky who worked as a barber. And he was an active operator on the Underground Railroad. He was arrested for being part of the Underground Railroad, and Beecher represented him. And we have this really great account from the newspaper at the time where Ritchie's brought to court and he pleads not guilty. And Beecher looks at him and says, "Then why are you here? Have you come to shave the court?" And Ritchie then left to supposedly go get his shaving material to shave the court. But actually, by the time the prosecutor was ready to proceed with the case, Ritchie had escaped to Canada, so he couldn't be prosecuted. So Beecher was very active in the Underground Railroad here in Sandusky. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of Eliza Fallon. Fallon was born September 4th, 1798. At the age of 11, he started working in a printing press. During the War of 1812, he served on a ship in the Great Lakes. He served as a powder boy or a powder monkey, and he served 90 days on the ship, which was typical militia service at the time. In 1819, he was sent to Rochester, New York to take over a printing press there. On February 4th, 1821, he married his first wife, Nancy Fillier. They ended up having 4 children together: Joseph, Sarah, Julia, and Nancy. In 1823, he was elected to the state legislature in New York. 7 years later, his first wife died on March 16th, 1830. On November 2nd, 1832, he married his second wife, Eliza Ward, and they ended up having 2 children, Eliza and Catherine. His second wife, Eliza, was born September 17th, 1801. In 1833, Follett bought large tracts of land here in Sandusky, and the next year, in 1834, they moved here. They both stayed during the cholera outbreaks to try and help the town, though Eliza was the one who was much more civic-minded in a way of helping out. She was part of different committees. She helped form the U.S. Sanitary Commission here in Sandusky. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was a group of women all throughout the country who were working on sending goods to soldiers in the Civil War to try and make their lives better, and each town had their own commission. So Eliza helped to organize the one here in Sandusky and help run it. They talk about in her obituary how she always tried to make sure that there were flowers in the hospitals for patients and trying to do what's best for the community. Follett was somewhat involved civically. He was on the Board of Education here in Sandusky, but he was also a very active businessman. He was a publisher. He ran a publishing company. What he's best known for is he was the publisher of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. He also helped to form the Lake Erie Mad River Railroad Company here in town. Unfortunately, his wife Eliza died first on April 29th, 1876. Next, they had a huge funeral for her here in town. The town basically shut down. It was held in one of the local churches. And we actually have pictures of the inside of the church from the day of her funeral. That's how well her funeral was documented at the time period. Follett died on October 12th, 1894, and the funeral was held in his home. Of course, his home was what would become the Follett House Museum today. As for the Underground Railroad, we know Follett publicly was always against slavery as far back as we can tell. He argued very loudly against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where one of those territories could be let in as a slave state. How active were they in the Underground Railroad is kind of hard to tell. In the Siebert papers, when someone asks about Underground Railroad activity in Sandusky, they tell them to contact Rand Follett, who knew all about the Underground Railroad in Sandusky, so obviously they were involved and active. The most famous story is a conversation between Aran and Eliza, where Aran says to his wife that it's against the law, referring to the Underground Railroad. Eliza replies, but there is a higher law. It's a really great story. The problem is the only person that tells that story is their granddaughter. Now, does that make the story not true? No, that doesn't make the story not true. But it does mean that we do have to take it with a pinch of salt that she could just be trying to make her grandparents look better. I'm sure they probably provided aid, so money, clothing, train tickets were really important because not everyone who came to Sandusky made their crossing at Sandusky. Some would go to Buffalo, New York, over to Detroit, and cross into Canada there. Did they hide people on property at the Follett House? Maybe. Once again, the only person who makes that claim is the granddaughter, but that doesn't mean it's not true. But we do know for sure that they were involved in the Underground Railroad. And with that, we'll go to the next grave. This is the grave of the Reverend Thomas Boston Holland. He was born in 1809 in Prince George's County, Maryland, to free African-American parents on Benjamin Ogle's plantation. Even though he was born free, he was placed in something close to indentured servitude on the plantation of Benjamin Ogle's son until he was 21. After that, he started traveling the East Coast as a preacher. When in Albany, New York, he met his wife and married her, Anna, who was born sometime around 1860. They ended up having 3 daughters, Susan, Sarah, and Georgina. They came to Sandusky shortly after they were married in 1839. When he came to Sandusky in 1839, the actual population, the African-American population in Sandusky was actually very small. It was less than 30 adult African-Americans. He was ordained as a Wesleyan Methodist preacher in Troy, Ohio in 1843. He preached in Sandusky, Norwalk, and Milan, so all around this area. From 1873 to 1876, he was the minister of the St. Stephen's AME Church here in Sandusky, which he helped found. He died, unfortunately, on September 8th, 1882, and they had his funeral at the church he helped found. To talk about what he did in the Underground Railroad, we have a quote from the Firelands Pioneer. Firelands Pioneer was a publication put out by the Firelands Historical Society that covered the history of the Firelands area. and this was in the July 1888 edition. It said, "Mr. Boston has always been a devoted friend of the slave, and his kindly services were always at their disposal. His house was constantly open to them, and when he had no more room, he was certain to find for them a friend in need where they could be taken care of. Ever since his first coming to Ohio, he has been known as a reliable friend of the fugitive, and the history of his many undertakings in their behalf would prove the most entertaining were the facts at hand." So as you can tell, he was a very important member of the Underground Railroad here in Sandusky. And with that, we'll head on over to the next grave. This is the grave of Rush Sloan. Rush Sloan was born here in Sandusky on September 18th, 1828. He attended Norwalk Academy for part of his education. He eventually studied law, and he was admitted to the Ohio Bar in Mansfield, Ohio when he was 21. Besides being licensed practice law here in Ohio, he is also licensed to practice at the Supreme Court and the federal courts as well. He married his first wife, Sarah Morrison, in 1854, and they had 2 children together, Frank and Thomas. She unfortunately passed away in 1870. In 1871, he married his second wife, Hannah Marshall, and unfortunately she died in 1872, and they had no children together. He married his third wife, Helen Hall, in 1874, and they ended up having 2 daughters together, Helen and Mary. In 1856, Sloan was a delegate to the convention that eventually formed the Republican Party. He served as the clerk of courts here in Sandusky for a while. In 1857, he was elected the probate judge of Erie County. He resigned in 1861 to become the special agent of the post office department in this area, and he served in that role until 1867 when he resigned. He became the president of the Sandusky, Dayton, and Cincinnati Railroad and served there for 10 years. He was elected mayor in 1879 and served for 2 years. I mentioned the Firelands Historical Society. He actually served as the president of the Firelands Historical Society in 1898 until his death. Once again, sometime after becoming mayor, he switched parties from Republican to Democrat. And once again, we're not sure why. It was something with local politics, but we're not sure what. He ran for Congress after 1879 as a Democrat, but didn't win. He died on December 21st, 1908. And they had the funeral at his house. Now, the Underground Railroad, we do know that he did hide fugitive seekers at his house. He eventually, in 1854, he freed 2 freedom seekers, and he was brought to court by the person who was their owner, well, who said who were their owners, Mr. L.F. Weimer, who claimed them as their property. Took him to court 3 different times and eventually won. Not Sloan, the person who claimed them as a property, Weimer. So Sloan had to pay a fine of $4,330.90, which was the cost of the property and expenses. The town raised $393 to help him pay for those expenses, and Sloan ended up having to pay the rest himself. But we do know that Sloan was an active member on the Underground Railroad here in Sandusky. So with that, we'll head over to the next grave. This is the grave of Captain Thomas McGee. Thomas McGee was born May 16, 1808 in Washington County, New York. Shortly after there, his family moved to Concord, which is in Erie County, New York. Then he moved to Buffalo, New York in 1817. The next year in 1818, he actually took a boat and came to Huron, and from there moved to Sandusky County. In 1821, he moved here to Sandusky. When in Sandusky, he originally worked for the Cypress T. Marshall Hotel here in town. After that, he worked as a steward on the steamer William Penn. On September 28, 1832, he married his wife, Rosamond Stewart. She died in 1877. He married his next wife, Ellen Overrocker, August 13, 1878. To my knowledge, I couldn't find evidence he ever had any children with either of his wives. After serving as a steward, he ended up being the master on the sloop Louisa Judson and on the schooners Platina, Sandusky, and others. He also ran the government supply vessel Watchful for 4 years, which supplied area lighthouses and the Coast Guard station. He died in his house on September 30th, 1880. His house was over on 825 Hancock, and that's where his funeral was held. According to the Seymour papers, he helped freedom seekers by giving them money and other aid, And also because he was a ship's captain and in charge of ships, he probably also helped freedom seekers get from Sandusky in this area over to Canada. And this is our last grave of the walk. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll be able to get together in person in the near future and be able to do more. Thank you for coming along.